The silence before death always sounds the same. It starts as a whisper of wind through abandoned buildings, the creak of rusted metal settling in the cold, the distant echo of boots on concrete that shouldn't be there. In the pre-dawn darkness of the Khost Province training facility, that silence wrapped around Staff Sergeant Maya Chen like a shroud she'd worn too many times before. 18 sets of eyes watched her from the shadows, and not one of them understood what they were looking at. She knelt in the center of the compound's main courtyard, wrists bound with military-grade zip ties, her plain gray uniform dirty and torn from 3 days of captivity. Her breathing was steady, too steady for someone who should be terrified. Her head was lowered, dark hair falling across her face, but beneath those strands, her eyes moved with the calculated precision of someone counting exits, measuring distances, cataloging threats. The men surrounding her had made their first mistake the moment they looked at her small frame and assumed victory. They were about to learn the difference between capturing prey and catching a predator. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to Military and Veteran Stories so you never miss these true tales of courage, and tell us in the comments, where are you watching from today? The training exercise had been designed to test survival, evasion, resistance, and escape protocols. SEER, training at its most brutal. Maya had volunteered for the high-value target role, playing a downed pilot who needed extraction. On paper, it was simple. Survive 72 hours of realistic captivity while 18 Special Forces operators attempted to break her resistance. What the operators didn't know was that Maya Chen wasn't just another pilot. She was something much more dangerous, hiding behind a cover story so deep that even her own command structure had forgotten who she really was. For 3 years, she'd worked as a logistics coordinator at various forward operating bases, filing reports, managing supply chains, staying invisible. Her personnel file listed her as a former Air Force transport pilot with basic infantry training. Her actual file was buried so far in classified systems that accessing it required clearance levels most generals didn't possess. The facility stretched across 12 acres of barren Afghan landscape, a maze of concrete buildings, shipping containers, and mock urban environments designed to simulate real-world operations. Guard towers rose from each corner like skeletal fingers, their searchlights cutting through the morning darkness in lazy, predictable patterns. Maya had memorized those patterns within her first hour. She'd also noted the placement of every sniper hide, every blind spot, every piece of equipment that could be weaponized. Her captors thought they were running the exercise. Maya had been running tactical calculations since the moment they'd captured her. Sergeant First Class Derrick. Haynes approached from her left, his combat boots crunching on gravel with the swagger of a man who believed he controlled the situation. Behind him, 17 other operators maintained their perimeter. Army Rangers, Green Berets, and a few SEALs who'd been pulled in for the training rotation. Elite soldiers, every one of them. Men who'd fought in Fallujah, Kandahar, and a dozen other hellholes where legends were born and weak men died. They saw a 5'4" woman with delicate features and soft hands who probably couldn't bench press her own body weight. Haynes stopped 3 feet away, close enough to establish dominance, but far enough to avoid any desperate lunges. His rifle hung loose across his chest, safety on, finger nowhere near the trigger. After all, what threat could she possibly pose? "Day 3, Chen," he said, voice carrying the bored confidence of someone who'd broken stronger prisoners than her. "You ready to call for extraction yet? Or do we keep playing pretend?" Maya didn't lift her head. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper, the sound of someone whose spirit was finally cracking. "Please, I just want to go home." A few of the operators chuckled. One muttered something about Air Force princess to his buddy. Haynes allowed himself a thin smile. None of them noticed the way Maya's right foot had shifted, creating better balance. None of them saw how her breathing had changed from panicked to controlled. None of them realized that her apparent submission was positioning, the same way a coiled spring looks relaxed right before it snaps. "That's what I thought," Haynes said, reaching for his radio to call the exercise complete. "Control, this is—" Maya moved. The world seemed to slow as 3 years of careful camouflage fell away like a discarded costume. Her hands, still zip-tied behind her back, twisted in a motion that looked impossible until physics caught up and the plastic restraints snapped like dental floss. Her body uncoiled with fluid violence, rising from a kneeling position into a combat stance so perfect it could have been used in textbooks. Her right hand struck Haynes's throat with surgical precision, cutting off his radio call and dropping him to his knees, gasping. Her left hand had already stripped his sidearm from its holster and acquired the first target. The shot came before anyone else could react. Operator down, paint round to center mass, kill shot. She moved again, a shadow given lethal purpose. The pistol tracked left, another shot, another kill. She rolled behind a concrete barrier as return fire erupted, 17 rifles suddenly chattering to life, muzzle flashes strobing in the pre-dawn gloom. But Maya wasn't where they were shooting. She'd vanished into the maze of shipping containers and mock buildings, taking Haynes's rifle and spare magazines with her. The operators spread out, professional and disciplined, but hunting something they didn't understand. In the sudden chaos, none of them heard her whisper into Haynes's commandeered radio. "Control, this is Go 6. Exercise parameters are now in effect. Tell them to bring more paint." Control's response crackled back, confused. "Go 6? We don't have anyone designated." "You do now," Maya said, and switched the radio off. Hidden in the shadows between two shipping containers, she began the methodical process of becoming who she really was. The frightened pilot facade dissolved completely, replaced by something colder, sharper, infinitely more dangerous. These 18 men thought they were hunting escaped prey. They had no idea they'd just released one of Delta Force's most lethal weapons into her natural environment. The real exercise was about to begin. 12 minutes into what the operators still believed was a simple search and capture mission, the first kill came from an impossible angle. Corporal James Mitchell was moving through the alley between buildings C and D, rifle up, following proper clearing procedures. He'd done this 1,000 times in real combat zones. He was careful, professional, alert. The paint round hit him center mass from a position that shouldn't have existed. A narrow gap between two shipping containers, 70 yards out, partially concealed by morning shadows. The shot was threaded through a space barely 6 inches wide. Mitchell looked down at the bright orange splatter across his chest plate, then up at the gap where the shot had come from. "What the hell?" His radio crackled with Sergeant Rodriguez's voice. "Mitch, report." I'm hit," Mitchell said, disbelief thick in his words. "Paint round, center mass, but the angle? There's no way she could have made that shot, no way. Negative, stay in character. You're KIA, move to extraction point." As Mitchell walked toward the designated dead zone, 17 operators suddenly realized they weren't chasing a frightened pilot anymore. Staff Sergeant Tommy Garrett crouched behind a Humvee, scanning the compound through his scope. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught him to read terrain like a book, to spot threats before they became problems. But the landscape in front of him seemed empty, too empty. "She's got to be in the main building," he muttered into his radio. "Only cover big enough to hide in." The response came from directly behind him. Wrong. Garrett spun, bringing his rifle around, but Maya was already moving. Her commandeered weapon struck his barrel aside as she flowed past him like smoke. The paint round caught him in the side before he could acquire her silhouette. 2 kills, 16 operators remaining, and now they were starting to get angry. "This is bullshit," Private First Class Danny Torres hissed into his radio. "She's cheating somehow. Gotta be. Nobody moves like that." "Stow it, Torres," came Rodriguez's sharp reply. "Maintain discipline. She got lucky twice. Won't happen again." But luck didn't explain the 3rd kill. Specialist Kevin Burke was positioned on the roof of Building A, 40 feet up with perfect overwatch of the entire compound. He had cover, concealment, and a clear field of fire. When Maya appeared in his scope, darting between 2 containers, he had all the time in the world to line up his shot. He never got to take it. The paint round struck him from ground level, angled upward through a window he'd forgotten to check. Maya had somehow worked her way inside the building below him, climbed 3 flights of stairs in complete silence, and shot him through a gap in the roof access door. Burke stared at the orange paint splattered across his shoulder. "How did she?" "Doesn't matter." Rodriguez's voice was tight now, professional calm starting to fray. "All units, we're dealing with someone with advanced tactical training. Adjust accordingly." Maya heard every word through the radio she'd taken from Haynes. She smiled grimly as she moved through the building's corridors like a ghost. They were finally starting to take her seriously. Too late. The fourth and fifth kills came simultaneously, a double shot that caught two operators as they attempted a coordinated breach of the warehouse. Maya had anticipated their movement, positioned herself in an elevated hide they hadn't considered, and eliminated both targets before they knew they were exposed. 13 left, she whispered to herself, chambering another round. By now, the surviving operators had stopped thinking of this as a training exercise. The easy confidence that had carried them through the first day was replaced by something harder, more focused. They moved with the disciplined paranoia of men who'd realized they were being hunted by a professional, but they still didn't know who she was. "I don't care what her file says," Sergeant First Class Marcus Webb growled into his radio. "Transport pilots don't shoot like that. This woman is something else." "Maybe she's got some kind of special forces background they didn't tell us about," suggested Corporal Lisa Zhang, the only other woman on the opposing force team. "Cross-training, maybe?" "Doesn't matter what she is," Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying the authority of a man who'd led teams through real firefights. "She's still just one person. We box her in, we end this." They tried. For the next hour, the remaining 13 operators executed a textbook containment maneuver, using fire and movement to compress Maya's area of operation into an increasingly small kill zone. They coordinated beautifully, communicated perfectly, and applied exactly the kind of pressure that should have forced any normal opponent into a fatal mistake. Maya let them think it was working. She stayed hidden in Building B, allowing herself to be pinned down while the net tightened around her. She even fired a few desperate shots at pursuing operators, shots that came close enough to be believable but not close enough to actually hit. The operators began to relax. They had her cornered. This was familiar ground, patience, pressure, and eventual victory. Exactly what they'd been trained for. Rodriguez keyed his radio. "All units, maintain perimeter. She's got nowhere to go. We take our time, do this clean." That was when Maya decided the lesson had gone on long enough. She activated Haynes's radio one last time, broadcasting on the frequency she knew all 13 operators were monitoring. "You want to know what I really am?" The question echoed through every headset, delivered in a voice that had shed every trace of fear or desperation. It was calm, professional, and carried an undertone of something that made several operators shift uncomfortably. "I'm going to show you." Maya Chen had spent 3 years hiding behind a fabricated identity, playing the role of a logistics coordinator who counted supplies and filed reports. But before that, before the cover story and the buried files and the need to disappear from official records, she had been something else entirely. She had been Operational Detachment Delta. She had been one of the most lethal counterterrorism operators the United States had ever produced. And now, in this abandoned training facility with 13 elite soldiers hunting her, she was about to remind them why that distinction mattered. The frightened pilot was gone. Ghost 6 was awake. Section 3. The First Hints. Competence Glimpses. The first hint that something had fundamentally changed came in the quality of Maya's movement. Sergeant Rodriguez, watching through thermal imaging from his position in the East Tower, saw her heat signature shift inside Building B. Not the frantic darting of a cornered animal, but something else. Fluid, purposeful, predatory. She moved through the corridors with the kind of spatial awareness that only came from years of close-quarters combat training. "She's different," he murmured into his radio, not quite able to articulate what his instincts were screaming. "Different how?" asked Corporal Zhang from her overwatch position. Before Rodriguez could answer, Maya appeared. Not where they expected her, not at the building's main exit or the obvious egress points they'd been watching. She materialized on the building's roof, in a position that should have required climbing equipment, moving with the silent confidence of someone who'd spent years infiltrating hostile territory. The sixth kill came as she acquired Corporal Zhang through her scope, a precise shot that traveled 180 yards through morning heat shimmer and dropped the spotter before she could call out a warning. Maya had somehow acquired a suppressor from somewhere, because the only sound was the soft cycling of her rifle's action. Zhang's down, Rodriguez reported, his voice tight. Single shot, long range, professional placement. The remaining 12 operators felt the psychological shift like a physical weight settling on their shoulders. This wasn't lucky shooting anymore. This was expertise, expressing itself through violence. Maya vanished from the rooftop as quickly as she'd appeared, leaving no trace except the impossible shot that had eliminated their best spotter. Private Williams, positioned near the motor pool, keyed his radio with shaking fingers. "Sarge, what exactly are we dealing with here?" The answer came not from Rodriguez, but from a voice that had appeared on their communication frequency like a ghost in the machine. Maya had somehow accessed their tactical network, her words reaching every operator simultaneously. "Delta Force Operational Detachment Alpha, call sign Ghost 6, specialization, counterterrorism and direct action, kill count classified." Silence stretched across the frequency like a held breath. Then Rodriguez's voice, barely controlled. "Bullshit. Delta doesn't exist on paper, and women don't serve in special operations?" Maya's voice cut through his denial with surgical precision. Title 10, USC Section 652, repealed October 2015. Sexual integration of Special Operations Forces began January 2016. "You're behind on your reading, Sergeant." Another silence, this one heavier, more uncertain. Maya continued, her voice carrying the kind of casual authority that only came from actual experience in classified operations. "Current remaining force, 12 operators, degraded communication security, compromised overwatch positions. Tactical assessment, you're fighting the wrong battle with the wrong assumptions." Corporal Martinez, hidden behind a shipping container, felt something cold crawl up his spine. The woman speaking wasn't reciting information she'd memorized. She was briefing them like someone who'd done this before, many times in places where mistakes meant real bullets and real death. "Prove it," Rodriguez challenged, trying to maintain command authority despite the growing dread in his voice. Maya's response came as action, not words. The 7th kill arrived 15 seconds later. Martinez, eliminated by a shot that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, striking him as he moved between cover points that should have been invisible to anyone without perfect tactical overwatch of the entire compound. The 8th kill followed immediately. Private Jackson, caught in crossfire from a position Maya couldn't possibly have reached that quickly, unless she'd planned their movements in advance, unless she'd been herding them into predetermined kill zones while they thought they were hunting her. "Multiple shooters," Specialist Carter gasped into his radio. "She's got backup. Has to be." "Negative," Maya's voice replied, still impossibly calm. "Single operator. You're experiencing tactical vertigo, the disorientation that occurs when your mental model of the battlefield doesn't match reality." She paused, and when she spoke again, there was something that might have been sympathy in her tone. "You're not fighting a transport pilot anymore. You're fighting someone who spent 8 years hunting high-value targets in denied territory, someone who's been exactly where you are right now, except with live ammunition and real consequences." The remaining 10 operators felt the weight of that statement settle over them like a burial shroud. They were elite soldiers, men and women who'd earned their positions through skill, dedication, and combat experience. But they were realizing, too late, that elite had gradations they'd never considered. Private Torres, his voice barely steady, keyed his radio. "Sarge, maybe we should call this exercise." The 9th kill interrupted his suggestion. Torres painted, eliminated by a shot he never saw coming from an angle that defied tactical logic. 9 operators left, and Maya Chen was just getting started. Rodriguez felt his command authority evaporating like morning mist. His carefully planned containment had become a methodical execution. His elite team was being dismantled piece by piece by someone who moved through combat like she'd been born to it. "All units," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd finally understood the scope of his mistake. "We are dealing with a legitimate special operations asset. Adjust tactics accordingly." But it was too late for adjusted tactics. Maya had spent the first phase of the exercise allowing them to believe they were hunting her. Now, as the sun climbed higher and shadows shifted across the compound, she was teaching them the difference between being hunted and being eliminated. The real demonstration was about to begin. The compound had fallen into an unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that precedes avalanches and executions. 9 operators remained, scattered across defensive positions that no longer felt defensive. They communicated in whispers now, as if speaking too loudly might draw the attention of something they had rather not face. Maya Chen moved through this silence like she owned it. From her new position atop Building C, a location she'd reached through a route that violated everything they thought they knew about the facility's layout, she could see the remaining operators struggling with a problem that had no clean solution. They were trained to fight enemies, not ghosts. They understood tactics, not terror. She activated her commandeered radio one final time. "Remaining force, this is your instructor speaking." The word instructor hit every surviving operator like a physical blow. Rodriguez felt his jaw clench as the implications settled over him. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. This was a masterclass, and they were the students. "Your first lesson," Maya continued, her voice carrying across the compound with professorial calm, "is about assumptions. You assumed you knew who you were fighting. You assumed your training gave you an advantage. You assumed wrong." Specialist Carter, hidden behind a concrete barrier near the motor pool, keyed his radio with trembling fingers. "What do you want from us?" "I want you to learn something that might save your lives in a real combat situation," Maya replied. "The difference between fighting an opponent and fighting a predator." That was when she demonstrated the lesson. The 10th kill came without warning. Private Henderson, eliminated by a shot that seemed to originate from thin air. He'd been positioned behind what should have been perfect cover, but Maya had found an angle that existed only in 3-dimensional space, ricocheting her paint round off a metal surface to strike him from behind his own protection. "Ricochets," Maya's voice explained over the radio, "academically precise. Useful when direct line of sight is compromised, standard curriculum in advanced marksmanship programs." The survivors exchanged glances filled with growing horror. They weren't just being hunted, they were being taught. Each kill was a demonstration, each elimination a lecture in applied violence. Rodriguez tried to maintain command authority. "All units converge on Building C, suppress and eliminate." Maya's response was immediate and devastating. She had somehow anticipated their movement because the moment the first operator broke cover to advance, she was there, not where her shot had originated, but flanking from an entirely different direction. 2 kills in rapid succession, Corporal Barnes and Specialist Wright, caught in a crossfire that shouldn't have been possible for a single shooter to execute. 7 operators left. "Lesson 2, Maya's voice continued, utterly unruffled by the violence she'd just unleashed. "Misdirection. Make your enemy commit to the wrong assumption, then exploit their commitment." Private Lopez, pressed against the side of Building A, felt something break inside his chest. This wasn't combat anymore. This was systematic destruction delivered with the casual efficiency of someone demonstrating a manufacturing process. "Sarge," he whispered into his radio, "we need to abort. This is—" "No," Rodriguez cut him off, but his voice had lost its earlier authority. Now it carried the desperate edge of a man who'd realized he was drowning, but couldn't stop trying to swim. "We finished this exercise." Maya heard the exchange and made a decision that would haunt every surviving operator for the rest of their careers. She revealed herself. Not partially, not as a fleeting shadow between buildings, but completely. She stepped into the center of the main courtyard, fully exposed, rifle held in a casual ready position. The morning sun caught her face clearly for the first time since the exercise had begun. What the 7 surviving operators saw was a woman who looked nothing like the frightened pilot they'd captured 72 hours earlier. This person stood with the relaxed confidence of someone who controlled every variable in the equation around her. Her movements were economical, precise, deadly efficient. Her eyes held the kind of calm that only came from absolute certainty in one's capabilities. "Final lesson," she called out, not bothering with the radio anymore. Her voice carried across the compound with parade ground clarity. "Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one who doesn't need to hide." She began walking toward Building A, where 3 of the remaining operators had taken position. Her rifle stayed down, not quite pointed at anything, but ready to acquire any target with minimal adjustment. Rodriguez, watching through his scope from the east tower, felt his finger tighten on his trigger. Perfect shot. Clean kill. End of exercise. But something in Maya's posture stopped him. She wasn't walking like someone who'd forgotten about the sniper in the tower. She was walking like someone who knew exactly where he was and had already decided whether he posed a threat. She hadn't decided he did. The realization hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. She was allowing him to watch because his position no longer mattered to the outcome. He was irrelevant to her tactical calculations. Maya reached the entrance to Building A and stopped. "Specialist Lopez, Corporal Kim, Private Stevens," she called out, somehow knowing exactly who was inside. "You have 30 seconds to make a choice." "What choice?" Lopez's voice came from inside the building, tight with fear. "You can continue this exercise and learn what happens when special operations soldiers fight someone with superior training, or you can surrender now and walk away with a lesson instead of a trauma." Silence stretched between the buildings like a taut wire. "And if we choose to keep fighting?" This from Corporal Kim, trying to sound defiant. Maya's response was delivered with the kind of professional calm that made it more terrifying than any threat. "Then I demonstrate why Delta Force operators don't fail selection, why we don't fail missions, and why we don't fail to eliminate targets." She checked her watch. 20 seconds. Private Stevens broke first. "I'm out," he called, his voice cracking. "I'm done. This is insane." He emerged from the building with his hands up, paint weapons slung across his back. His face was pale, but his eyes held something like relief. 15 seconds, Maya announced. Specialist Lopez appeared next, moving with the wooden gait of someone whose nerve had finally snapped. I can't do this anymore." Corporal Kim held out for the full 30 seconds, pride warring with survival instinct. When time expired and he still hadn't emerged, Maya simply nodded. "Your choice, Corporal." She entered the building. The paint round that echoed from inside sounded different somehow, final, decisive, unavoidable. When Maya emerged 60 seconds later, she was alone. 4 operators remained. Rodriguez, still watching from the tower, felt his worldview reorganizing itself around a new and terrible understanding. He wasn't observing a training exercise anymore. He was watching a surgeon work, each movement precise and purposeful, each decision made with clinical detachment. Maya looked directly at his position, not in his general direction, but at him specifically, as if she could see through concrete and steel to meet his eyes. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she called out, "you're wondering whether you should take the shot." His rifle scope wavered slightly. How could she possibly know what he was thinking? "You should know," Maya continued, "that I've been tracking your position since the exercise began. Range, 87 meters. Wind, negligible. Angle of elevation, minimal. Should be an easy shot for someone with your training." Rodriguez felt sweat bead on his forehead despite the morning chill. "The reason you haven't taken it," Maya said, "isn't because you can't make the shot. It's because you're finally starting to understand what you're really dealing with." She was right, and that realization hit him harder than any paint round could have. Some primal part of his brain, the part that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments, was screaming that pulling that trigger would be a mistake of catastrophic proportions. Maya began walking toward the tower. 4 operators left, she announced, her voice carrying easily across the compound. "Time for the final examination. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more inspiring military stories like this one." Section 5. The recognition begins. Witnesses connect dots. Captain Sarah Mitchell had been watching the exercise unfold from the control room, surrounded by monitors displaying thermal imaging, drone feeds, and radio communications. For the first 2 hours, she'd been entertained by what looked like a standard SEER training scenario, experienced operators hunting an escaped pilot through realistic terrain. Now, she was leaning forward in her chair, staring at screens that showed something entirely different. "Pull up Chen's file again," she ordered the technician beside her. Staff Sergeant David Park tapped his keyboard, bringing up the familiar logistics coordinator profile they'd all seen dozens of times. Standard military photograph, basic service record, unremarkable assignment history. There has to be more, Captain Mitchell muttered, studying the image of a woman who looked nothing like the tactical surgeon currently dismantling an elite 12-man team. Run a deeper search. Access level 7. Park's fingers hesitated over his keyboard. Level 7 was reserved for classified operations data. Ma'am, that requires... I have the clearance, Mitchell cut him off, entering her authorization code. Something's not adding up here. The search results took nearly 3 minutes to populate, systems cross-checking databases that existed in carefully compartmented silos. When the new file appeared on screen, every person in the control room fell silent. Classified, eyes only. Subject Chen Maya LDODID, redacted. Unit assignment, Operational Detachment Delta. Specialization, Counterterrorism Direct Action. Status, Deep Cover Assignment, Project Grey Ghost. The technical details that followed painted a picture that made Captain Mitchell's hands tremble slightly as she scrolled through combat records, classified mission summaries, and performance evaluations that read like something from a military thriller. Sniper Qualification Score, 98.7 of 100, Exceptional. CQB Proficiency, Expert Languages, Arabic, Fluent, Pashto, Conversational, Russian, Basics. Confirmed Eliminations, Classified Decorations, Bronze Star, 2, Purple Heart, Distinguished Service Cross. Jesus Christ, whispered Specialist Anderson from his position at the communications console. She's been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. Outside, Maya had reached the base of the East Tower, where Rodriguez waited with his rifle trained on the access ladder. 3 other operators maintained overwatch from scattered positions, their confidence slowly rebuilding now that they had her pinned in an obvious kill zone. What they couldn't see from their positions was Maya pulling a device from her pocket, a small electronic unit that looked like a standard military radio but functioned as something much more sophisticated. In the control room, every screen suddenly flickered. "What the hell?" Park muttered, frantically typing diagnostic commands. The main display resolved into a new image. Maya's face, captured by her own device and broadcast directly into their monitoring system. She had somehow tapped into their entire surveillance network. "Control, this is Ghost 6, she said, looking directly into the camera. "I'm assuming you've accessed my real file by now." Captain Mitchell found her voice. "Ghost 6, this is Control. Confirm your identity." Maya's image shifted as she moved, the camera following her with professional stability. Maya Chen, Staff Sergeant, Operational Detachment Delta, Service Number, redacted, Authentication Code, Whiskey 77, Tango Golf. The control room's authentication system immediately confirmed the codes as valid. "Ma'am," Maya continued, "I need you to understand something about what you're watching. These operators are good soldiers. They've done nothing wrong except make assumptions based on incomplete information." She paused, and when she continued, her tone carried a weight that made everyone listening lean forward. But they need to learn what it feels like to be on the receiving end of asymmetric warfare. They need to understand what our enemies experience when Delta goes hunting. Captain Mitchell felt her stomach clench as the implications settled over her. "Are you saying this entire exercise has been a teaching moment?" Maya confirmed. "These men and women will deploy again. They'll face enemies who've been trained by people like me. They need to know what that feels like before their lives depend on it." The camera angle shifted as Maya began. Climbing the tower ladder with fluid efficiency, one hand operating the device while the other maintained her grip. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the speakers, tight with desperation. "I've got a clear shot. I can end this." "Sergeant Rodriguez," Maya called up to him, her voice carrying easily despite the climb. "What's your assessment of my tactical position?" There was a long pause before Rodriguez answered, his voice thick with the realization that had been building for the past hour. You're exactly where you want to be." "Correct. And why haven't you taken your shot?" Another pause, longer this time. When Rodriguez spoke, it was with the voice of a man who'd finally understood the nature of his situation. "Because you've been letting me think I had one." Maya's climb never slowed. "Outstanding, Sergeant. You're learning." In the control room, Captain Mitchell watched with growing awe and horror as Maya reached the tower platform. The camera showed Rodriguez backing away from his rifle, hands slightly raised, no longer thinking of himself as a hunter, but as prey that had been allowed to live. "Ghost 6, Mitchell said into her microphone. "What's your mission objective here?" Maya's response was delivered while she efficiently zip-tied Rodriguez's hands, not roughly, but with the professional competence of someone who'd done this many times before. To demonstrate the difference between conventional special operations and Tier 1 capabilities. To show these operators what they're really up against when they deploy. She looked directly into the camera again, and Captain Mitchell felt something cold crawl down her spine at the absolute calm in those eyes. And to remind everyone watching that the United States military has people like me. People our enemies should be very, very afraid of. The camera went dark as Maya switched off her device. On the ground below, 3 operators remained in their positions, no longer hunting but simply waiting for whatever came next. They'd stopped thinking about winning the exercise. Now, they just wanted to survive it. Section 6, the verification, truth cannot be denied. The silence that followed Maya's transmission stretched across the compound like a held breath. In the control room, Captain Mitchell stared at dark monitors while trying to process what she'd just witnessed. Outside, 3 elite operators crouched behind cover that no longer felt like protection. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the radio from his position atop the tower, now zip-tied but still able to communicate. "All units, stand down. I repeat, stand down. This exercise is over." "Negative," came Corporal Thompson's reply from near the motor pool. "We don't take orders from prisoners." "You're not taking orders from me," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying a weight that made everyone listening pause. "You're taking them from someone who's been teaching us what real special operations looks like." Maya's voice cut. Through their debate with clinical precision, "Corporal Thompson, Specialist Morris, Private Walsh, you have a choice to make." The 3 remaining operators felt their blood chill at the casual way she spoke their names. She'd been tracking not just their positions, but their identities, their individual tactical signatures. "You can continue this exercise," Maya continued, "and I'll demonstrate the final lesson. What happens when Delta Force stops playing games? Or you can acknowledge what you've learned and walk away." Thompson, pressed against a Humvee with his rifle trained on Maya's last known position, felt something like rage surge through his fear. "What we've learned you're some kind of super soldier fantasy playing dress-up in a training exercise." The words hung in the air for exactly 3 seconds. Then Maya appeared. Not where Thompson was aiming, not where any of them expected, but directly behind Private Walsh's position. She'd somehow covered 80 yards of open ground without appearing on thermal imaging, moved through a kill zone that should have been impossible to cross unseen. Walsh spun, bringing his rifle around, but Maya was already inside his weapon's effective range. Her hand struck his wrist with surgical precision, deflecting his aim as her other hand painted his chest with a point-blank shot from her sidearm. "Lesson complete," she said quietly, then vanished again before Thompson or Morris could acquire her. Walsh stared down at the orange paint splattered across his vest, then at the empty space where Maya had stood. How did she?" His radio crackled with Maya's voice. "Close quarters combat advanced techniques, part of the curriculum you don't get access to." Thompson, watching through his scope, felt his hands begin to shake. The woman he'd been hunting had just demonstrated capabilities that existed outside his understanding of human physical limitations. She moved like physics were suggestions rather than laws. "Specialist Morris," Maya called out, "you're wondering if your thermal imaging is malfunctioning." Morris, crouched behind a shipping container with his advanced optics package, felt his throat go dry. She was right. He'd been scanning continuously and hadn't seen her approach Walsh's position at all. "It's not malfunctioning," Maya continued. "I'm wearing technology you don't have access to, technology that exists specifically to defeat your technology." The implications of that statement hit every operator like a physical blow. They weren't just fighting someone with superior training, they were fighting someone with superior equipment, superior support, superior everything. "Who are you really?" Thompson called out, his voice cracking despite his efforts to maintain composure. Maya's answer came from a new position, closer to his location than should have been possible. I'm what $3 billion in training and equipment produces when you apply it to someone who volunteers to do the jobs nobody else can handle. She paused, and when she continued, her tone carried something that might have been sympathy. I'm what you might become if you're very good, very lucky, and very committed to protecting people who will never know your name. That was when the real demonstration began. Maya didn't eliminate the remaining 3 operators quickly. Instead, she spent the next 20 minutes showing them exactly how outclassed they were. She appeared and disappeared like smoke, always exactly where they weren't looking, always one step ahead of their tactical adjustments. She painted Thompson with a ricochet shot that defied geometry. She eliminated Morris by predicting his movement pattern so precisely that her shot was waiting for him when he arrived at what he thought was a secure position. Each elimination was accompanied by a brief tactical lecture explaining exactly how she'd achieved the impossible. Angular mathematics, she explained after the ricochet kill. Standard geometry adapted for combat applications. Behavioral prediction, she noted after eliminating Morris. Pattern recognition applied to human movement under stress. By the time only Thompson remained, he'd stopped trying to fight and started trying to simply understand what he was witnessing. "Final lesson, Corporal," Maya called out from somewhere in the maze of shipping containers. The difference between being good and being elite isn't just training, it's mindset. Thompson, alone now behind his Humvee, felt the full weight of isolation pressing down on him. What mindset? The understanding that there's always someone better, someone faster, someone who's trained harder and longer and with resources you can't imagine. Maya's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The humility to know when you're outmatched. And what's that supposed to teach me? Maya appeared one final time, stepping into the open courtyard with her rifle slung across her back, hands empty, completely vulnerable. "It's supposed to teach you," she said, walking calmly toward his position, "that when people like me are on your side, you never have to be afraid of anyone else." Thompson stared at her through his scope, finger on the trigger, perfect shot lined up. All he had to do was squeeze and the exercise would be over. But something in her posture, in the absolute confidence with which she approached him, made his finger freeze. She wasn't walking like someone who'd forgotten about the rifle pointed at her head. She was walking like someone who knew something he didn't. "Take the shot, Corporal," Maya said gently. "Or don't. Either way, you've learned what you need to know." Thompson held his aim for another 10 seconds, then slowly lowered his rifle. Not because he couldn't make the shot, but because he finally understood what Maya had been trying to teach them all along. The exercise wasn't about winning or losing. It was about recognizing the difference between being a soldier and being something more. "Exercise complete," he said into his radio, his voice carrying a respect that hadn't been there hours earlier. "All units, stand down." In the control room, Captain Mitchell stared at monitors showing 18 operators in various stages of elimination or surrender, all brought down by one woman who'd spent 3 years hiding her true capabilities behind a logistics coordinator's desk. The training exercise was over, but the real education was just beginning. The compound had fallen into a strange, electric silence. 18 operators stood or sat in various positions around the facility, each marked with orange paint, each carrying the weight of what they'd just experienced. The exercise was officially over, but nobody moved to leave their positions. Maya Chen stood in the center of the main courtyard, no longer the frightened pilot they'd captured 3 days ago, no longer the hidden logistics coordinator who'd spent 3 years filing reports. She was exactly what her classified file claimed, a Tier 1 operator who'd just delivered a masterclass in applied violence. But what happened next surprised everyone, including Maya herself. Corporal Thompson was the first to move. He walked slowly from his position behind the Humvee, his rifle slung across his back, paint still wet on his tactical vest. When he reached the edge of the courtyard, he stopped and did something that made Captain Mitchell's breath catch in the control room. He came to attention and saluted. Not the quick, perfunctory gesture soldiers offered to superior officers during routine interactions. This was different, deliberate, respectful, held longer than regulation required. The kind of salute reserved for moments that mattered. "Ma'am," Thompson said, his voice carrying across the compound with crystal clarity. "It has been an honor." Maya's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this. The exercise had been designed to teach tactical lessons, to prepare these operators for the realities they might face in combat. She hadn't anticipated the human moment that was unfolding. She returned his salute with the same deliberate respect he'd offered. That simple exchange broke something loose in the watching operators. Private Walsh, still shaking from his close-quarters encounter with Maya, pushed himself to his feet and walked toward the courtyard. His salute followed Thompson's, crisp and heartfelt. "Ma'am," he said, "thank you for the lesson." Then, Specialist Morris emerged from behind his shipping container, his thermal imaging equipment forgotten. His salute was steady despite the tremor in his hands. One by one, they came. Rodriguez, freed from his zip ties, climbed down from the tower and crossed the courtyard with measured steps. His salute was held the longest, accompanied by words that carried the weight of someone who'd glimpsed the true scope of his profession. "Ma'am, I understand now what we're really training for." The others followed. Corporals Barnes and Wright, eliminated early in the exercise but still present for the lesson. Specialists Carter and Burke, who'd learned what it meant to be outmaneuvered by someone with superior tactical knowledge. Private Torres, whose voice had cracked when he'd first realized what they were facing. Each approached individually. Each offered their respect. Each carried themselves differently than they had 3 hours earlier. In the control room, Captain Mitchell watched the spontaneous ceremony unfold with growing emotion. "Are you recording this?" she asked Staff Sergeant Park. "Yes, ma'am," Park replied, his own voice thick with something like awe. "Every second." The salutes weren't just acknowledgement of Maya's rank or her performance in the exercise. They were recognition of something deeper, the understanding that they had witnessed excellence in its purest form, that they had been taught by someone who represented the absolute pinnacle of their profession. But it was Sergeant First Class Derek Haynes who delivered the moment that would be remembered long after the paint had been washed from their uniforms. Haynes had been the first to encounter Maya when she'd shed her frightened pilot persona. He'd felt her hand strike his throat, watched her transform from prey to predator in the span of a heartbeat. The experience had shattered his assumptions about capability, about training, about what was possible when preparation met opportunity. He approached Maya with something like reverence, stopping 3 feet away before coming to the most perfect attention of his military career. His salute was parade ground precise, held with the kind of respect usually reserved for fallen heroes. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the compound, "we came here thinking we were hunting a pilot." He paused, gathering words for something that had no easy expression. "We leave knowing we've met someone who makes us all better soldiers just by existing." Maya felt something shift in her chest, an emotion she'd kept carefully buried during 3 years of hiding her true identity. These operators, elite soldiers who'd earned their positions through skill and sacrifice, were offering her something precious, recognition not just of what she could do but of what it meant. Her response, when it came, was delivered with the quiet dignity that had defined her throughout the exercise. "You honor me with your respect. But remember this. Everything you've seen today, every technique, every tactical decision, exists to protect people who will never know our names. That's the real mission. That's what makes it matter." The words settled over the gathered operators like a benediction. They understood, perhaps for the first time, that elite capability wasn't about personal achievement. It was about service at a level most people couldn't comprehend, sacrifice most people couldn't imagine. As the individual salutes concluded, something unprecedented began to happen. The 18 operators, without consultation or coordination, began to arrange themselves into formation. Not because anyone had ordered it, but because the moment demanded structure, ceremony, recognition of what they had witnessed. They formed neat ranks in the courtyard, facing Maya with the kind of disciplined precision that only came from men and women who dedicated their lives to military excellence. When the formation was complete, they came to attention as one. 18 hands rose in perfect synchronization, 18 salutes held steady, unwavering, magnificent in their unity. The sound of boots snapping together echoed across the compound like thunder. Maya stood at the center of it all, surrounded by respect she'd never sought but had undeniably earned. The late morning sun cast long shadows across the facility, but the light seemed to focus on this moment, this spontaneous ceremony honoring not just a superior operator, but the ideal of excellence itself. In the control room, Captain Mitchell found herself standing without realizing it, her own hand rising in salute, though she was separated from the scene by concrete walls and electronic monitors. "That," she whispered, "is what leadership looks like." Section 8. The Antagonist's Moment, Authority Humbled. The formation held for nearly 2 minutes, an eternity in military time, a moment that would be seared into the memory of everyone present. When Maya finally gestured for the operators to lower their salutes, the spell broke slowly, reluctantly, but the ceremony wasn't over. Colonel James Morrison had been watching the exercise from his office in the facility's administrative building, monitoring radio traffic and reviewing after-action reports. What he'd observed had transformed his understanding of training, capability, and the personnel under his command. Now, he walked across the compound with measured steps, his command presence evident even at a distance. The assembled operators parted automatically, creating a clear path between him and Maya. Morrison was a career officer who'd earned his position through 3 decades of exemplary service. He'd led men in combat, managed complex operations, commanded respect through competence and integrity. But as he approached Maya Chen, he carried himself with the humility of someone who'd just learned that authority came in forms he'd never considered. He stopped 10 feet away and studied her face, really looking at her for the first time since she'd been assigned to his facility 3 years earlier. The woman he'd seen as a competent but unremarkable logistics coordinator was gone, replaced by someone whose calm confidence spoke of experiences and capabilities that existed far above his clearance level. "Staff Sergeant Chen," he said, his voice carrying across the silent compound, "I owe you an apology." Maya's eyebrows rose slightly. "Sir?" Morrison stepped closer, his expression grave. "For 3 years, I've watched you work. You've been efficient, reliable, invisible. I thought I knew exactly who you were and what you brought to this facility." He paused, and when he continued, there was genuine regret in his voice. "I realize now that I've been managing someone whose capabilities I couldn't even comprehend, someone who's been gracious enough to perform duties far beneath her qualifications while maintaining perfect operational security." The gathered operators listened with rapt attention. Apologies from colonels to staff sergeants weren't part of normal military protocol, but nothing about this moment felt normal. "Sir," Maya said quietly, "I was following orders. Deep cover assignment, operational necessity. You weren't supposed to know." Morrison nodded slowly. "I understand that now. What I don't understand is how you maintained that cover while watching undertrained personnel struggle with problems you could have solved in your sleep." Maya's response carried the weight of 3 years' worth of careful restraint. "Because the mission required it. Because sometimes the best way to serve is to let others learn their own lessons. Even when those lessons came at the cost of operational efficiency. Especially then, sir. These operators needed to develop confidence in their own abilities. My job was to ensure supplies reached them on time and in good condition. Their job was to become the soldiers they needed to be." Morrison absorbed this, recognizing the discipline it must have taken to watch problems she could solve while maintaining her cover identity. "And today's exercise?" "Was an exception," Maya admitted. "These operators are about to deploy. They needed to understand what they might face. Sometimes the best teacher is experience, even simulated experience." The colonel studied the paint-marked operators surrounding them, men and women who carried themselves differently than they had that morning. "And what have they learned?" Maya's answer was directed not just to Morrison, but to every person within hearing. That excellence exists, that preparation matters, that somewhere in the United States military are people trained to handle problems they can't imagine, and that when they deploy, they're not alone. Morrison felt the truth of those words settle over him like a physical weight. These operators would carry today's lesson with them into real combat zones, into situations where understanding the full spectrum of Allied capabilities might mean the difference between success and failure, between coming home and being lost forever. "Staff Sergeant," he said, "I'm going to ask you something that's probably above my authority level." "Sir? How many others like you are out there? How many people with your capabilities are hiding in plain sight?" Maya's smile was small but genuine. "With respect, sir, that's not a question I can answer. But I can tell you this: America's enemies spend a lot of time worrying about people like me. Our allies sleep better knowing we exist, and that's exactly how it should be." Morrison nodded, understanding that he'd reached the limits of what could be discussed in an open forum. But one thing remained to be addressed. He stepped back and came to attention. His salute, when it came, was delivered with the full weight of his rank and experience. It wasn't the gesture of a superior officer acknowledging a subordinate's performance. It was the recognition of one professional to another, the acknowledgement of capabilities that transcended normal command structure. "Staff Sergeant Maya Chen," he said, his voice carrying formal authority, "on behalf of this facility and every soldier who will benefit from today's training, thank you for your service." Maya returned his salute with precision that matched his own. "Sir, it's been an honor." But Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, still holding his salute, "I'm recommending this exercise for inclusion in advanced training curricula across all Special Operations Commands. What happened here today needs to be preserved, studied, and replicated." He paused, then added with something like wonderment, "I've never seen anything like it." Maya's response was delivered with the humility that had defined her throughout the exercise. "Sir, what you saw today wasn't special. It was just preparation meeting opportunity. Every operator here has that same potential." "Perhaps," Morrison conceded, finally lowering his salute, "but not everyone has your level of preparation." As the formal ceremony concluded, the assembled operators began to disperse slowly, reluctantly, carrying with them an experience that would influence every subsequent mission, every tactical decision, every moment when they needed to remember what peak performance looked like. Maya watched them go with satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with mission accomplishment. These soldiers would deploy with a deeper understanding of their profession, a greater appreciation for the capabilities that surrounded them, and the confidence that came from knowing exactly what excellence looked like. The exercise had been designed to teach tactical lessons. Instead, it had become something much more important, a reminder that in the vast machinery of American military power, there were individuals whose capabilities exceeded imagination, whose dedication transcended normal understanding of service. And sometimes, when the moment was right and the lesson was needed, those individuals stepped out of the shadows to remind everyone else what was possible. 3 weeks later, the Coast Province Training Facility had returned to its normal rhythm of instruction and evaluation. Operators came and went, training cycles continued, and the daily business of preparing soldiers for combat proceeded without interruption. But something fundamental had changed. It was visible in small details that only careful observers might notice. Operators moved with greater tactical awareness, their movements more deliberate, their communication more precise. Training scenarios that had once been approached with casual confidence now received the full focus of participants who'd learned to question their assumptions about capability and preparation. Maya Chen had returned to her logistics duties as if nothing had happened. She processed supply requests, coordinated equipment deliveries, and maintained the invisible efficiency that kept the facility running smoothly. To casual observers, she appeared to be exactly what her cover identity claimed: a competent administrator focused on mundane but essential tasks. But those who'd participated in the exercise saw her differently now. When she passed through the operations center, conversations paused with respectful recognition. When she offered suggestions during planning sessions, carefully phrased as logistical concerns rather than tactical recommendations, her input was received with the attention normally reserved for senior advisors. The 18 operators who'd faced her in combat carried themselves with the confidence that came from knowing exactly what elite looked like. Captain Mitchell had spent days reviewing every moment of recorded footage from the exercise, studying Maya's movements, analyzing her tactical decisions, documenting techniques that defied conventional training models. The after-action report she'd submitted had been classified immediately and distributed to training commands across all service branches. "It's not just the skills," she'd written in her summary, "it's the mindset, the complete integration of capability with purpose. This operator doesn't just execute techniques, she embodies them." The report had generated immediate interest from senior leadership. Within a week, requests had begun flowing in for similar exercises, for access to Maya's expertise, for opportunities to expose other units to the kind of training that had transformed 18 elite operators in a single day. Maya had declined all such requests. "Deep cover assignments require deep cover," she'd explained to Colonel Morrison when he'd presented the opportunities. "The mission hasn't changed." Morrison had understood, even as he'd regretted the limitations it placed on leveraging her capabilities. But he'd also recognized that Maya's greatest value might lie not in direct instruction, but in the example she'd set, the proof that excellence existed and could be achieved through proper preparation and dedication. The real legacy of the exercise revealed itself in the performance of the 18 operators during their subsequent deployments. Corporal Thompson, deployed to Afghanistan 3 months later, credited his survival during a complex ambush to lessons learned during Maya's exercise. "I kept thinking about what she'd said," he reported in his after-action brief. "About the difference between being good and being elite, about always being someone better. It made me more careful, more aware, more prepared." Specialist Morris, serving in Iraq, used behavioral prediction techniques he'd observed during the exercise to identify and neutralize an insurgent sniper who'd been terrorizing his unit's area of operations. "She showed me how to think like the enemy," he wrote in his commendation report, "how to anticipate movement before it happens." Rodriguez, promoted to staff sergeant and assigned as an instructor at the Special Operations Training Center, incorporated elements of Maya's methodology into his own curriculum. "It's not about teaching specific techniques," he explained to his students. "It's about teaching humility, about understanding that there's always more to learn, always a higher level to reach." Each success story found its way back to Maya through unofficial channels. Conversations in mess halls, mentions in classified briefings, stories passed between operators who'd learned to recognize the signature of her influence. She read these reports with quiet satisfaction, knowing that the exercise had accomplished its true objective. She had created better soldiers. More importantly, she had created soldiers who understood the true scope of their profession. 6 months after the exercise, Maya received new orders. They arrived through the same deep cover channels that had placed her at the facility 3 years earlier, encoded instructions that only she could decrypt. The message was brief, direct, and familiar in its operational simplicity. Ghost 6. New assignment effective immediately. Location, classified, duration, indefinite mission, continue excellence. She'd known this day would come. Deep cover assignments had expiration dates, and her time at Coast had served its purpose. The facility now operated at a higher standard because of lessons learned during her tenure, not just from the exercise, but from 3 years of observing an operator who maintained peak performance even when no one was watching. On her final day, Maya conducted her usual inventory of supply warehouses, filed her last batch of procurement reports, and secured the logistics system she'd maintained with quiet efficiency for 36 months. Her replacement would find everything in perfect order, accompanied by documentation that would ensure seamless operational continuity. She left no personal items behind, no photographs, no mementos, no evidence that anyone extraordinary had ever worked in the small office beside the main warehouse. The only trace of her presence was the elevated performance standard that had become the facility's new normal. As her transport helicopter lifted off at sunset, Maya looked down at the compound where she'd spent 3 years perfecting the art of invisible excellence. The 18 operators who'd faced her in exercise were scattered across the globe now, but they carried her lessons with them like ammunition for battles not yet fought. Colonel Morrison, watching from his office window as the helicopter disappeared into the darkening sky, understood that he'd witnessed something remarkable during his tenure. Not just the exercise, though that had been extraordinary, but the quiet demonstration of what true professionalism looked like when practiced at the highest levels. His final entry in Maya's personnel file was brief but comprehensive. Staff Sergeant Chen represents the finest traditions of military service. Her contribution to this facility's operational readiness cannot be quantified through normal metrics. Recommend immediate approval for any future assignments or operational requirements. Classification level: eyes only. The file was sealed and transferred to archives accessible only to those with need-to-know clearance. But Maya's real legacy lived on in the operators she'd trained, the standards she'd established, and the proof she'd provided that excellence wasn't just an ideal, it was an achievable reality for those willing to pursue it without compromise. Somewhere in the world, another assignment waited. Another opportunity to serve in the shadows, to maintain capabilities that others couldn't imagine, to ensure that America's enemies faced opponents they weren't prepared for. Maya Chen, call sign Ghost 6, disappeared back into the deep cover world that had shaped her, carrying with her the quiet satisfaction that came from a mission completed and a lesson delivered. The operators she'd left behind would never forget what they'd learned, and somewhere, in situations they couldn't yet imagine, that knowledge would save their lives. Epilogue. 2 years later, in a classified briefing room at the Pentagon, a general reviewed operational reports from theater commands around the world. Performance metrics showed consistent improvement in special operations effectiveness, with particular strength in adaptive tactics and situational awareness. "What's driving the uptick in field performance?" he asked his aide. The aide consulted his tablet, scrolling through training evaluations and deployment success rates. "Sir, it appears to correlate with personnel who've participated in advanced SEER training at facilities that have adopted new psychological preparation protocols." "Such as?" "Exposure to asymmetric capability demonstrations, training scenarios that challenge fundamental assumptions about tactical advantage. Personnel report increased humility and awareness after these experiences." The general nodded approvingly. "Excellent. Who developed these protocols?" The aide hesitated. "Sir, the origin is unclear. The techniques appear in multiple training curricula simultaneously, but there's no central development authority listed." "Ghost program?" "Possibly, sir. Or individual initiative by field instructors who recognized effective methodology." The general closed the folder, satisfied with results, even if their source remained mysterious. "Continue monitoring. If it's working, I don't need to understand it." As the briefing concluded and the room emptied, neither officer noticed the single word penciled in the margin of one report: Ghost. Some victories were too important to claim credit for, some teachers were too valuable to identify, and some lessons echoed long after the instructor had vanished back into the shadows where legends lived. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe for more military and veteran stories. These true tales keep the courage alive for generations to come. And in the comments, tell us where you are watching from and who's the quiet leader you'll never forget. This completes your female veteran military hidden elite identity script, following the structure and emotional intensity of your inspiration stories, with Maya Chen's transformation from underestimated logistics clerk to revealed Delta Force operative, serving as a masterclass in earned respect and tactical superiority.